and welcome to this special edition of SPS Global Insights, where we investigate today's ever-evolving security landscape. I'm your host, Laura Woods, and this afternoon we have a distinguished lineup of experts who will provide valuable insights into current global security challenges and effective risk mitigation strategies. Later, we'll be joined by SPS's Director of Global Assistance, Stephenson CBE, in studio, who will shed light on practical measures to minimise risks in an increasingly complex world. But now, joining us from the UK is Professor Shea, a renowned expert in strategy and security from the University of Exeter. Welcome, Jamie. Good afternoon to you, and thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon, Laura. Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Jamie, can I start by asking you how you would describe the current global security environment?
Well, it's increasingly complex, Laura, and it's also increasingly dangerous. We've moved from the Cold War, which was a period of high tension, yes, but also high stability in terms of the balance of power between the United States, NATO, the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, and the basic conservatism of the two sides that were keen to avoid any prospect of war with each other. Today, people often like to talk about the multipolar world, and that's clearly the case. There are more actors in the game. For instance, medium-sized powers that didn't really have much of a role during the Cold War. You know, think Saudi Arabia, for example, think Turkey, think Brazil, have now come on the stage as quite major players. Indeed, even launching military operations all by themselves. They're far less under the supervision or the direct control of their superpower patrons than was the case with most countries, either in the Soviet camp or in the Western camp during the Cold War. You also see that countries have to deal with many security challenges all at once. You know, when I was at NATO, Laura, because I used to be a NATO official for 38 years, it was essentially one problem in one place at one time. You know, we had the Cold War, obviously, with the balance of power in Europe, Checkpoint Charlie, the Fulda Gap and all of that. And then in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union went away, we spent 10 years engaging in the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Kosovo, North Macedonia, trying to bring peace to that area. Yugoslavia wound down just in time for 9/11, the terrorist attacks against New York and Washington, D.C. And then, as you know, and as the viewers will know, NATO and the West went off to Afghanistan for a lengthy period. But as they were preparing to withdraw from Afghanistan, then there was the campaign in Libya. And fortunately, in a way, when Putin invaded Ukraine last year, it was probably good that NATO had withdrawn by then from Afghanistan, because, you know, if we still had Afghanistan to deal with and also the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that could seriously overload the system. But we're not in a world any longer, Laura, where we can simply focus all of our efforts on one particular threat in one geographical region against one particular adversary at one time. For example, NATO, in its new strategic concept, which was published in Madrid last year, has put China on the agenda as a major source of concern, a strategic competitor, while its relationship with Russia has become much more confrontational. Dealing with the two sort of big authoritarian states at once, who are very different in the type of challenge they pose, is going to be obviously one of the defining challenges as we move ahead. You also, I think, are seeing a few other tendencies. World military spending is going up. This past week, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, showed that military spending has now reached annually $2.4 trillion. Not only coming from Russia or China, but of course also from the US and from Europe. Moving to increase its defense budgets. We've never had so much focus on military forces, on military R&D, on military enhancements ever before. We've seen a greater propensity of authoritarian states to take risks. You know, Russia is far less conservative. Putin is much more risk-prone than Soviet leaders like Brezhnev or Gorbachev ever were. And Russia has launched a series of military attacks well before last year's invasion of Ukraine. China has also become very assertive militarily in the South China Sea. The risk of an incident, for example, between the US and Russia, we saw one recently where the US drone intercepted in the Black Sea, Russia and the US potentially clashing in Syria, the US potentially clashing with China. When the superpowers have an antagonistic relationship and they are pushing their forces closer and closer to each other, the risk of an escalation is very real indeed. We are now seeing a return to warfare. For many years after the Cold War, the conclusion was, well, war doesn't make sense. It doesn't pay. We're going to lose as much as we gain. Let's find other ways to bring our opponents down, like economic coercion, like cyber warfare, like disinformation campaigns, what NATO calls hybrid warfare. But you're now seeing, for example, with Azerbaijan using force to settle its scores with Armenia, the Saudis, some years ago, taking their forces into Yemen, and of course, Russia invading Ukraine, that war is back. It seemed once again as worth the risk, an acceptable way of getting your way and achieving a domination. That's potentially worrying. I mean, I won't talk now about what has happened to Ukraine in just 1 year of warfare, but if you look at the casualties, if you look at the economic destruction, for example, if you look at the displacement of people, we haven't seen anything like that since World War II. We thought that those kind of total war scenarios had gone away from ever. I also would like to mention the problem in this modern world, Laura, that most countries have divided loyalties. During the Cold War, if you were in the American camp, you were economically, socially, culturally, politically, militarily in the American camp. But today, most countries like to straddle the divide. Look at all of those African and Latin American countries, even NATO ally Turkey, that have refused to impose sanctions against Russia. They want to be in the West, but they want to have good relations with the authoritarians at once. They don't want to choose unless they absolutely have to. Look at Turkey. It's in NATO, but this week it's been meeting with Russia, Iran, and Syria and normalizing its relations with Damascus. So we're dealing with a phenomenon, Laura, that the Americans like to describe as frenemies. In other words, they're with you on Monday, but Tuesday, are they still with you? They're not. They're not so certain. Their military interests for security sometimes run counter to their economic interests, and they're juggling the balls and sitting on the fence and just trying to find a way through, keeping their avenues of communication open with everybody at once. That makes the management of security much more complicated and time-consuming, keeping everybody on board than it was certainly during the Cold War, when solidarity, when alignment were basically automatic. And finally, Laura, I mean, obviously this is a big topic, one could speak at length, but finally, the collapse of norms. I, in my NATO career, spent most of my life and time, modestly, but with determination, trying to establish a set of norms. Nuclear weapons would be constrained by nuclear treaties. Cyber attacks would be constrained by limits and confidence building measures. It would not be okay to attack civilian critical infrastructure or energy grids. War crimes would not be committed because they would be, as we saw in Yugoslavia, effectively prosecuted and elsewhere. In other words, war would be humanized. The liberal international order would put a set of rules in place which would stop the worst from happening. Unfortunately, my hopes of a sort of rules-based order are not being borne out. Treaties are collapsing and not being replaced by new treaties. Treaties where they do exist are being disregarded. We are back to might is right. We're soon in a situation where there will be no constraints, for example, on countries building up nuclear weapons or introducing new types of nuclear weapon and so on. And basically, that for anybody who believes in a rules-based order, which even the authoritarians would sign up to as the basic minimum that's in everybody's interest, will be rather alarmed. So, as Jonathan Swift said in Gulliver's Travels, my purpose is to inform you, not to entertain you. This is obviously not very entertaining, but we have to sort of deal with the world as it is, unfortunately, and not as we would have hoped after the Cold War that it would turn out to be.
Well, you've certainly informed us. I found that utterly fascinating listening to you there, Jamie, discussing I suppose the evolution of power, the power struggle, the new players on the scene now, new things like cybersecurity and cyber warfare happening, as well as the traditional warfare, and of course multiple divided loyalties, as you mentioned too. Can I ask you then, taking all of that into account, what do you think, in your professional opinion, is required for, let's say, individuals, businesses, corporations, and I suppose we've talked about the nations, but not only to survive but thrive despite the security risks in the current environment?
Well, my sense, of course, is that first of all, we are now in an era of hybrid warfare where everything is a target. The old days were, targets were sort of military barracks. They were sort of, land borders, ports. The obvious sort of military security infrastructure. But of course, today, as we see with cyber attacks, for example, disinformation campaigns, influence operations, everything is potentially a target, and adversaries, can switch from one target to another in the way that terrorists, switch from passenger airliners to cargo planes. Once security on commercial airlines improved after 9/11. So businesses, whether they like it or not, can't be neutral. Can't say, well, we're just a business, we don't want to be part of this. They are going to get drawn in. Business leaders in China are arrested simply because they have an American or a British or a European passport, just like they are in Russia. Our adversaries don't see our companies as neutral. They firmly believe that they are part of the sort of security establishment as much as the military or the police or the border guards or anywhere else. So the first thing I would say to business is, don't think you can put up the white flag of neutrality and go back to business as usual. You've seen from cyber attacks, for example, ransomware attacks against, colonial pipelines in the United States that shut down its system. You saw this also with, the JMB meat packaging company, also the victim of a cyber attack. As long as these companies are seen by adversaries as part of critical national infrastructure, like communications, like IT, banking services, for instance, pipelines, they will be the target. And if they haven't done due diligence on their resilience and their security, if they haven't followed government guidelines, then they won't expect much public sympathy. They won't expect much public sympathy when they announce that they've had losses and suffered these crippling attacks. The other thing, of course, is that you have to be mindful that businesses can be attacked even when they are not the direct target. This is the weird thing about the modern world. I mean, take, for example, the attack that occurred in Ukraine a few years ago when the Russian intelligence service attacked the MDOC tax filing system of the Ukrainian government. The problem there was that a large number of Western companies operating in Ukraine, for example, the Danish shipping company Maersk, were infected by the malware, and Maersk, its global logistics supply chain, and Maersk is responsible for 25% of world container shipping. So it's absolutely crucial. It's not just a company, it's 25% of the world economy to some degree. Maersk was shut down for about a month. I had to call in a large number of experts and so on in order to clean up its systems and get back up and running. And the Financial Times calculated later on that companies, including Maersk, could suffer damages of $8 billion cleaning up the mess from what was a collateral damage attack, which is so easy, of course, in the cyber world. Whereas the Ukrainians, in fixing the MDOC system, only had to spend a couple of $1 million. So I think this is an object lesson that, if there's a lot of mud flying around, some of it will hit you. I think the third thing I would say, Laura, to this very important question, is that the private sector are going to be increasingly pulled in to the government security. We're going to go much more on a war footing in the West. than we've been used to. We're talking about restocking ammunition, reopening production lines, reshoring vital supply chains like chips, like explosives, certain chemicals, and so on. Industry is going to be asked by government, to have these production lines ready as a surge capability when they are required, to hold large stocks. Just-in-time delivery is gone, as we see that we have to be resilient and hold large stocks. Increasingly, government is going to turn, as the Danes did after this so-called NotPetya cyber attack that affected Maersk. Government is going to come to the private sector and say, we want your people. We want them to be reservists, not traditional reservists, shooting in the forest at weekends, but reservists because they have important skills in data analysis, in disinformation, in cyber, for example, in repairing energy grids very quickly, as you've seen in Ukraine. And we want to mobilize your people and have the right to mobilize your people. And we want them to be trained. And, we want you to release them for a couple of months a year so that they can have training and work with government experts and so on. You're going to see a much greater merger between the private sector and the old-fashioned type of Western security establishments, much more toing and froing as civil servants spend time in industry to learn how it works, and as private sector executives spend time in government, so that everybody knows each other and everybody's joined up. So just like in Ukraine, the private sector has gone to war for the first time. 1,000 companies have disinvested from Russia. They haven't all done it for economic reasons. A number of them have done it for patriotic reasons. We've had, Elon Musk saving the Ukrainian internet, which was attacked by Russia. The Viasat system, and replacing it with Starlink. You've seen this unprecedented mobilization of the private sector to help deal with the refugee crisis and so on. So the private sector is going to be on more of a war footing and has to be ready to go to war. It may not fight in the traditional sense by shooting off bullets, but it's going to be very much dealing with the critical infrastructure, the domestic front, the civil emergency planning, the resilience, the overall continuity of government and society in a wartime situation. So that would be at least a message that I would want to send to the executives who are watching the program. And I'm pretty confident that many of, hopefully, will be nodding their heads rather than shaking their heads, saying, yes, Jamie, we can already see signs of this happening.
Okay, Jamie, thank you so much. It's been so interesting talking to you today, and thank you for sharing your valuable time and offering such intriguing insights. Thank you.
Laura, it was a great pleasure, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Now, as I mentioned earlier on, we're also joined by Rob Stephenson, SPS's Director of Global Assistance. Thanks a million for joining us, Rob. Fascinating to hear what Professor Jamie Shea had to say. And one thing that really stood out for me was the lack of communication that is now evident on a global scale, whereas in the past, countries seemed to be much more friendly with one another. Now it doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, Laura, well, my job at SPS is to manage our security response globally. And I think what we heard from Jamie, we certainly recognise where we are. And not only the fact that the state-on-state conflict is creating instability globally, which is compounded probably by the fact that there isn't that cooperation and coordination that we saw in previous times. But also on top of that, then not only the state conflict, but also the increased terrorism, which is probably a product of some of that instability caused by conflicts elsewhere. So a really sort of complicated security environment that we're operating in.
So with that in mind, what does it mean then for corporate bodies, for employees around the world working away from home? I mean, how can they mitigate these factors? How can they stay safe?
Well, I think two of the key things I took away from Jamie's talk was firstly that everybody's a target. And, you can't be neutral in an unstable world. So businesses, individuals, corporations, have to accept they're operating in an increasingly challenging environment. And I think he talked about proliferation, and he talked about proliferation of weapons, but also the proliferation of technology, which means that capabilities which perhaps existed only within sort of state organizations in the past are now available to terrorist groups, to organized crime groups. So things like cyber technology, the ability to hack into computers, to get hold of our data, to use artificial intelligence to create deep fakes, to be able to hold people or extort people virtually through the internet. Those sort of challenges we see, happening a lot. So I think it's not only the physical preparation and mitigations that need to be considered, but also the mitigations from the technical perspective as well.
Of course, when people are travelling abroad, there's always the risk of kidnapping, and people will be well versed in these risk factors. But now adding the extra layer of AI and virtual kidnapping, it seems that these criminal organisations really are on top of the cyber world.
Well, I think we have so much information on our laptops, on our mobile phones, out on social media. We become incredibly vulnerable because of the amount of information we're putting out there. And it's definitely a sort of rising threat that we see people targeting vulnerable travellers or businesses with at the moment.
Rob, another thing that really struck me from Jamie's discussion, he did say that nowhere was safe anymore. Traditionally, you would have an idea anyway, whether it's false or not, of safe places in the world, safe countries to visit. But he honed in on Europe, saying that Europe traditionally would be considered safe. That's not the case anymore. There are risks everywhere.
Yeah, and I think some of that is a consequence of the conflicts that we see going on, and clearly there is a very major conflict going on in mainland Europe at the moment between Russia and Ukraine, and that has a knock-on effect and overspill into neighbouring countries. But also the threats, as I say, from technology or the vulnerability of technology, any opportunity for for terrorists or organised criminals to try and target people, it's irrelevant of borders, and so it's definitely places where we might have thought were safe are vulnerable, perhaps not from the physical threats, but more from the sort of cyberspace.
So for those travellers, then, what can SPS do for them?
Well, I think we would recognise a number of things that we can offer as a company, but actually more generically that people should be prepared to consider. So first of all, you need to stay aware of the environment, and you need to be scanning the horizon, thinking about what the situation is, what the threats are out there. And part of this product today is to be able to do that and start thinking about those challenges and inform people. I think the other thing we would recommend is some training and preparation before any crisis happens, or before any traveling or event. And certainly you need to be prepared, and you need to consider those threats before they happen. So training and preparation beforehand. Clearly, any sort of security measures, any planning that needs to go into that is certainly something we would help with and assist with. And we have a dedicated crisis management team that specifically can help with those things.
I suppose traditionally people might think that if they're travelling abroad, their embassy is on hand to help. But that's not necessarily always the case, or if it is the case, it may not be as quickly as you need the help. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and again, I think Jamie talked about the fact that there are multiple crises and multiple issues going on around the globe today. And the reality is that some of the big nation states are committed to certain areas. They have had to withdraw from other parts of the world. We see, the vulnerability that's going on in Sudan at the moment. The fact that the capabilities that perhaps we would have seen in the past to be able to respond to these crises just don't exist anymore in the across the globe. So I think the being prepared to operate independently, or to take responsibility for your own security and seek other ways of mitigating those threats, not just expecting national support to come at time of a crisis.
We always think, sure, it'll never happen to us, don't we? And I suppose there's a sense of hope and of goodwill, but that's what insurance is all about. Insurance is just an extra added bit of help that hopefully you'll never need to use, but you have it there anyway. And so you would advise anyone travelling for any amount of time, be it with a corporate entity or with family or on their own, just to look into all of the available options.
Absolutely. And, we offer a number of opportunities to support that. Certainly through our gear product, we would look to be able to help people be prepared before they travel, to stay informed where they are travelling, and to stay connected to a response if they do get into trouble when they are overseas. But absolutely, an insurance policy of some form is clearly important when you are travelling in such an unstable environment as we find ourselves in today.
Rob, we all know how busy life can be if you're getting ready to travel abroad, especially if you're going to move to a different country for a job or for a long period of time. So it's very difficult to remember to do everything that you should be doing. But it seems at the moment that there's a real interest in this pre-event consulting. So what exactly goes on there?
Yeah, so our crisis management team would be able to offer a service where they could come and work with an organisation to do planning and preparation before an event or before a deployment of any sorts, work with the organisation to make sure all the plans are in place, and be able to provide advice and guidance, not only for the planning, but then also potentially in event of an incident when any organisation or individuals are travelling. And again, it's really about making sure they're as prepared as possible and have a response in place in case of the worst case scenario.
Most of us, in fact, all of us have heard of travel insurance, and it's a box to be ticked when you're traveling abroad. But there are so many different layers and so many insurance policies of all different types on offer for the traveller, and some specifically related to people going away to perhaps areas of crisis for prolonged periods of time. So what kind of policies and what can SPS offer people in those situations?
Well, again, our crisis management team supports a special risk insurance product, and it would be able to support, again, with the planning for going away to some of those high threat environments, and to be able to provide a dedicated team that could respond in the event of an incident, whether it's in response to a kidnap situation, a crisis like the situation we find ourselves in Sudan at the moment, and have dedicated specialists on call to be able to help resolve whatever the issue might be.
So, Robbie, what you're saying is if a person travelling away finds himself in crisis, that there is a plan in place to either help them out where they are at the moment or to extract them if needs be.
Yes, I mean, that's what we would seek to be able to deliver. And certainly we would seek to provide the advice to make sure people are as well prepared beforehand. Clearly, every situation is slightly different. And we found a very challenging environment at the moment in Africa. But again, we can provide certain services, certain bits of advice, and then depending on the environment, be able to support with either medical support, security support, evacuation assistance, those sort of things when the environment's right. So,
Rob, for your insured clients then, are you able to create, I suppose, a crisis management plan of some sort specifically for them, depending on where they're going and how long for, and what sort of risks they may come across?
Yes, so I think we would offer that absolutely as part of our pre-event consulting, and we would look to encourage organisations to prepare a crisis management plan, which we would assist with, and that would ensure that we consider all the risks, all the eventualities for an event or for people travelling abroad, so that we have not only a plan in place, but we are clear that we have the responses in place to be able to mitigate the risks that they might face. So we would absolutely encourage any organisation to have a crisis management plan in place, and we would be more than happy to support companies to develop those.
Finally, Rob, what are the main points that you would like people who would be travelling to consider before they head off?
Well, I think, again, if we take it back from what Jamie said, we have to understand it's a really complicated and an increasingly unstable world we're operating in. And that's not just for governments, it's not just for corporations or businesses, it's for individuals as well. And so I think what I would say is make sure, first of all, you understand the environment, do as much preparation as planning beforehand, and then have a response in place to be able to assume that you can react when the worst case happens. And certainly that is what SPS is here to support with, and we'd welcome the opportunity to discuss that with any people who'd like some help with that.
Rob Stephenson, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
That concludes our special edition of SPS Global Insights with Professor Jamie Shea and Rob Stephenson. A big thank you to both of them for sharing their invaluable insights on the global security environment and the essential role SPS plays in mitigating risks. As the world continues to evolve and new challenges emerge, you can count on SPS to be reassuringly there at the forefront of protecting businesses and individuals alike. We remain committed to delivering the most up-to-date and comprehensive comprehensive security intelligence, enabling you to navigate these complex times with confidence and peace of mind. For more information on how SPS can support your security needs, don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest updates on global security intelligence and expert advice.